Well, thank you guys so much for being here today. We've got a great crowd. Of course, General Mr. Smith, thank you guys as well. I'm very excited for this important conversation to kind of start kicking off the day here at SAFE. And I want to just open up by a bit of a broad question. And Mr. Smith, if it's all right, I'd like to start with you. What are the most important features of the U.S. right now that give us our power and our influence?
Well, the United States power, in my opinion, comes most importantly from the fact that after World War II, we were the preeminent military power. We've maintained that. Obviously, it's slipped a lot because we haven't invested in it as a share of GDP to the appropriate levels for a long time. Second, it's because we opened our markets for trade. I think that's the most important thing that kept us out of World War III. And then pertinent to the discussion of this conference, up until '73, we were energy self-sufficient. In fact, I think about 85–90% of the fuels used by the Allies in World War II to win the war were produced in the United States. '73, that flipped. We became a net importer, and the Yom Kippur War occurred, and the Arab states embargoed our oil. And later on, that led to the Energy Security Leadership Council, which is where General Conway and I and Robbie Diamond first met. And then our system of alliances around the world. So those were the things that made the United States the success it was. And then we had a bunch of wonderful entrepreneurs that figured out how to get a lot more oil out of our shale than we could before. And here we are again, back energy sufficient. But I think trade and energy and a preeminent military in our system of alliances are what created the country's prosperity. And unfortunately, a lot of that we're sort of throwing away these days.
And General Conway, maybe you can kind of build on that answer a little bit. I mean, as far as what you're seeing as our strengths and maybe what you're seeing as our loss of strength at this point.
Yep, sure, Emily. I'd echo a lot of what Fred just said. First of all, I think as Americans, our constitutional values, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, are also of global interest. And people recognize that, and in the end, they come to trust us. You know, I think since we came onto the world stage in the 1918 World War I, it's fair to say that we have been the most benevolent superpower the world has ever seen. And you know, when other nations' forces cross borders, the question is, are they ever going to leave? When American forces cross a border, the question is, even amongst the troops, how soon do we get home? And I think people can live with that and accept that. Maybe Colin Powell said it best, you know, for all of our international involvements, for all the intrigue overseas, the only land this country has ever sought was that which we needed to bury our dead. And I think that's how the world sees us, and so there's an element of trust that develops there. In a practical sense, and it pains me as an old Marine to say this, but credit to the United States Navy, because they had kept open those sea lanes of communication and made our projection of power and all of that trade available to us. And they've done a very good job of managing their budget and keeping the ship strengths where they need to be over the decades, in the last 30 years or so. And again, to echo Fred, you know, trade with the United States. We're an energy powerhouse in the world these days. Countries admire our business, our culture, and so forth, and so they simply want to deal with us, and they accept our power projection and our involvement.
So those are influences. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, and maybe General Conway, will start with you this time. What are the challenges that the U.S. and its allies are currently facing that really challenge our influence and power?
Absolutely, and there are some. Not least of which are our national debt. Okay, at some point we're going to have to come to deal with that, and I fear that it's not far over the horizon. So you know, we spend a lot of money as a government, and I think to be able to afford things that we're doing, are going to be impacted by the debts that we hold. Rand did a study probably 10 or 12 years ago now when Fred and I were both on the ESLC that said it costs this country $80 billion a year to protect those sea lanes of communication. And so I think that those costs may be coming due before we're prepared to deal with them vis-a-vis our national debt. In the Pacific in particular, our adversary actions, have impact. We don't have the freedom of maneuver on the high seas, I think, that we used to. There's a philosophy that China follows. One of their iconic heroes, a gentleman named Sun Tzu, said that the greatest success is the battle the general doesn't have to fight. So today, I think China is in the process of trying to degrade our influence in the Pacific, and particularly with our allies. Their centers of gravity are those governments in Japan, in South Korea, and the Philippines, and arguably even all the way down to Australia and India. And they're trying to express the fact that we are a nation in demise and that there's a new big dog in the region, and it's China. So if you want to continue to trade with them and partnership with them, you need to do so, I think, sort of at our expense. Again, in a practical sense, the Chinese now have built a supersonic ship killer missile called the D-100 that has a range out to 3,000 miles. So virtually anywhere, Emily, west of Guam, our ships, particularly our major capital ships, can be considered at risk should the Chinese decide that we're too involved and they need to attack us. It concerns me that we've got a disconnect in the country. Pew Center did a research a few years ago now, probably 5 years or so ago now, and America is the most patriotic country in the world. 47% of our citizens answer the question, saying that America is the greatest nation on earth. Now, 47% doesn't seem real good until you look at the second place on that study, and it's a combination of Australia and India, and they're at 36%. England, France, and Britain are at 12, 11, and 9% successively. Now, there's a disconnect, though, when it comes to our youth. And only 28% of American youth have evidence that they are willing to fight for this great country. And so I actually think that somehow that patriotism of our older generation is not transmitting itself to our youth. And frankly, I blame our education system, at least in part, for that. Teaching in some cases that America has a bad history and therefore America is a bad country. And so we're having to pay exorbitant bonuses these days to bring people into the services. It affects recruitment. And people aren't joining out of patriotism, they're joining out of hard cash. And of course, that comes from the defense budget, and that's not an ideal situation to have to deal with. So I think those are the sort of turbulence on the water out there that could impact our involvement in the long term.
Sure. So the debt, China, and just American patriotism. Mr. Smith, I'd be interested, same question to you. What are really the biggest challenges to American influence right now?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, harking back to what I said initially about America's influence and place in the world, was really driven by our system of alliances and opening our markets to the people that were defeated in World War II. We had the Marshall Plan in Europe. We pushed very hard after World War II for the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and most of the architecture of the post-World War II world was Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. And Hull famously said in 1934, initially, and then he put it in his memoirs, when goods cross borders, armies rarely do. So that became American policy in 34, Roosevelt and Hull, with the Trade Adjustment Act trying to drag us out of the Great Depression, which had been in part caused by protectionist legislation in 1930, the famous or the infamous Smoot-Hawley Act. So fast forward to where we are today in our political situation, both presumptive presidential candidates are anti-trade. And there's a vision that we're going to reindustrialize America and manufacturing is going to come home. It's really not very realistic given our workforce and our legal system. And yet our Navy, to Jim's comment, we're out protecting trade, firing missiles and flying F-18s off of these carriers, protecting Asia to Europe trade in the Red Sea. So to his point, our policies are sort of a combination of this residual benevolent hegemon, or whatever you want to call the American, the Pax Americana after World War II that's given us all this prosperity, and a vision in our political process that we ought to disconnect from the world and not have our Navy keep the sea lanes open and so forth, but yet we're still doing it. So I think it's a very confused period of time in terms of American policy versus a really sober view of the relative economics of trade around the world. We, unfortunately, are not going to make T-shirts in the United States. We used to make them. We don't anymore. We're not going to make low-value added furniture in the United States. And interestingly enough, just in the last 6 months, Mexico became the United States' largest trading partner as opposed to China. So you got to have a plan, a policy, and today it's just a bunch of rhetoric without regard to what actually made America prosperous since the end of World War II. Those things got to be squared away, particularly the fact that we're going in debt to the tune of $2 trillion a year. And we just won't pay for our consumption.
And I do hear you on the trade, on the fact that, you know, the U.S. is not going to be able to manufacture all of the products that we have. At the same point, I know there was a shift during COVID where Americans really came conscientious of supply chains, where they suddenly couldn't get chips, they couldn't get cars, they couldn't get so many products. And I feel like that has driven some of the discussions around decoupling, has driven, say, the CHIPS Act and trying to get more manufacturers here in the U.S. And I'm just wondering kind of how you square those two things. The need for trade in some capacity, but also to make sure that the U.S. is not caught on the back foot should something happen with one of our trading partners.
Well, what's happening in supply chains, and nobody knows this better than FedEx, we operate in 220 countries. I mean, we can give you every day a referendum on the world's economy and who's buying what from whom. So what's happened as a result of all of those things and the CHIPS Act and the American Recovery Plan and so forth would best be described as nearshoring or friendshoring. So in Europe, an awful lot of the manufacturing is going into Poland. It's going to become an economic powerhouse. They will surpass the United Kingdom in terms of the income per capita in the next couple of years. Intel is building a big chips factory southwest of Warsaw. As I mentioned, Mexico is now our largest trading partner. I've been to Mexico 4 times in the last year. There are 1,000 manufacturing plants or industrial park locations in Mexico where manufacturing is beginning to expand even further. A lot of it with components coming in from Asia, some of it undoubtedly from China, through Vietnam or other middle countries. So supply chains are adjusting, not necessarily in the most efficient way, but to deal with that exact issue where you have more faith in the supply chains for a future pandemic or a future issue. Markets always adjust despite what the politicians think or talk about, because people are moving in their own self-interest to build things, sell things, and so forth. But the Asian situation, to the general point, with China's position, they want to be indigenous and make most of their high value added products. I think the plan was called by President Xi, China 2025. So a lot of the production that was traditionally in China and their demographics are working against them as well. It's moved to Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, and a lot of that trade that we're firing these missiles and running these carrier sorties against the Houthis is protecting that trade from Southeast Asia to Europe under the umbrella of the United States Navy, to Jim's point. So again, our policies and our rhetoric are quite different than what's actually going on the ground, or on the sea, better put.
Sure, and we certainly got trade, and I think General Conway, I think when we think also about our relationships with the wider world, we also think about the U.S.'s power when it comes to intervening in certain areas, Ukraine, Taiwan, and I'm wondering, you are seeing this hesitancy now in Congress to continue to fund Ukraine, a lot of questions over that. Can you talk a little bit about what that stance is doing to the U.S. position globally?
Yeah, I think, Emily, we need to examine what does the world expect of a global power, in this case the United States, and I think they look to us for some level of sophisticated diplomacy to help solve the world's problems. Prior to the wall coming down, United States, it was pretty much a unipolar world. The United States was most powerful since World War II and continued to be that in terms of both the economy and the military. Since then, it is much more a multipolar world with the collective Europe, Russia, of course, China, and the new figure on the scene is India. And we need to learn to live in that world, I think, in a more realistic sense. Now, as a superpower, we need to realize that the hammer is not the only tool in the kit box. Okay, there's other things that we can and should be doing vis-a-vis Ukraine and Taiwan. Part of it is identifying what are our actual vital national interests. And I think that Ukraine, in a very real sense, is a vital national interest to us. They are fighting a proxy war against one of our biggest potential adversaries. And I think that the Congress writ large needs to realize that they've appealed to us for help, they've appealed to Europe for help, and that, to the degree we can ensure they stay in the fight, we have a national obligation to do that. And I'd like to think that the Congress can maybe relearn the art of compromise and help out a friend and ally, not a formal member of the NATO partnership, but a friend and an ally in a time of serious need. From my perspective, and it is just my thought, I think Taiwan is a lot further from being that vital national interest than is Ukraine. Taiwan, I think, is a continuation of now is what, a 75, 80-year-old basically civil war between the Chinese and giving due respect to those Chinese weapons that are anti-access. I think we need to be very careful that we don't find ourselves in a situation in the Pacific where we're baited by the Chinese into a situation that can appear to our allies to result in a position of weakness. So there's a lot there that I think needs to be examined, and a lot of it is dependent upon this whole idea of our international responsibilities. And Emily, I would simply add, at least in military circles, the word intervene is a dirty word. Okay, we need to make absolutely sure that it does represent a vital national interest before we put forward those forces that risk the lives of our great young men and women.
Absolutely. Mr. Smith, obviously FedEx, a lot of trucks, a lot of gasoline that's used there. I know your company is also, of course, looking into EVs and electric vehicles. And I'm just sort of interested if you could talk a little bit about the wider focus on energy, on national security, on oil, and sort of what you feel like the future holds in terms of these new technologies that are coming out.
Well, again, the Energy Security Leadership Council, his predecessor, General P.X. Kelly, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, recruited me to come on the ESLC to develop a national energy policy during the early part of this century because we didn't have one. And at that time, we were importing large amounts of oil from countries whose interests weren't the same as ours. Most of them were nationalized oil companies. And given the precedent of the 1973 Arab oil embargo, we needed an energy policy. So the simple policy that we developed was, one, maximize production of oil and gas in the Western Hemisphere so our oil supply lines weren't vulnerable to interdiction or embargo. Second, was to use less of it, and largely because of the great work of SAFE and its offspring, the Energy Security Leadership Council, the Bush administration, which was run by two oil men at the time, recognized this issue and reinstated fuel efficiency standards, which had been allowed to lapse from the 1990s. And the third prong was to develop alternatives. So if you looked at the infrastructure of oil and gas and looked at alternatives, really the only viable one was battery power and electric propulsion. And Senator Lamar Alexander, our great senator from Tennessee, was one of the leaders in funding the Department of Energy to do a lot of the basic research in our national labs that led to the improved battery densities, to set up a corollary to our very famous Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, with ARPA-E, which was an advanced projects section of the Department of Energy. And people forget this, but the loan system in the Department of Energy related to ARPA was the source of about $450, $500 million that Elon Musk used to continue the production of the Tesla, which of course revolutionized the world. Now, there is an alternative. So at FedEx, we're deploying large numbers of EV pickup and delivery fleets. We have over-the-road trucks. We have about 215,000 trucks of one sort or another around the world. I think it's the largest fleet in the world, not sure. But the pickup and delivery fleet, you're actually at a point where battery density has gotten to the level where you can have a positive ROI and profit accretion moving from internal combustion to battery powered. That's not true of heavy trucks. A lot of work going on there in fuel cells. There are some electric trucks. Tesla has one. I think we have a small number. They're very heavy and the range isn't at the same level. And then at the bottom is personal automotive transportation, and that requires subsidies, and big ones, to make them competitive against internal combustion engines. And as your network has reported very well, the adoption rate of electric vehicles has flattened, surprising everybody who is really pushing for the electrification of transportation. So the only thing that's going to really make people buy more electric cars, whether they're Tesla or European or the Chinese, who are now the largest producers of electric cars. And by the way, the reason they went into the battery business with such an enormous focus was they're well aware that during World War II, the U.S. Navy interdicted the oil coming up to Japan, and that arguably was the most important thing that allowed the Allies to win the war, up to and the dropping of the atomic bomb is memorialized in Oppenheimer that got all of the Oscars. So the Chinese understand that. You go through the Strait of Malacca, you can interdict all the oil coming from the Mideast into China. China's support for Russia without limits, I believe, is the term that President Xi and President Putin of Russia used, is largely about redirecting the Russian oil and gas away from Europe to China. So a huge part of the American policy and world politics are driven by these oil flows and the dependence on energy. So those three principles that the ESLC, under SAFE's auspices, produce maximum amount of oil and gas in the Western Hemisphere, check, because of fracking. We're doing that. Second, use less of it. Well, guess what? You know, our technology allows us to do it, and per unit of GDP, we're using much less energy today than we did 25 years ago. And then electrification is becoming a viable alternative, and if there are breakthroughs on battery density, I think you'll see in the next 5 or 6 years, an EV is actually less costly to produce and less costly to buy. So trends are going in the right direction that meet the vision of the ESLC from now almost 20 years ago. This has profound effects because we are self-sufficient in energy, but we're not going to be out of the oil and gas business for decades. So anybody that thinks that that's the case is a pipe dream. Last thing I'll say is the real problem on reducing energy consumption and emissions in the transportation sector is airplanes, because I just described the way I think that personal vehicles are going to evolve. We're already there in terms of a positive ROI for centrally recharged pickup and delivery vehicles or buses or garbage trucks or things like that. In aviation, that's a different matter because sustainable aviation fuel is not scalable in our opinion. It costs much too much. So we gave a large gift to the Yale School of the Environment to try to develop solutions to remove enough carbon from the atmosphere through geological and hydraulic processes to offset all of commercial aviation. And I'm proud to report I think they're going to be able to do that. So we've been working very hard on this. Lots of people are working very hard on it, and I'm optimistic for the reasons that I just said. We're energy self-sufficient in the Western Hemisphere. There are alternatives now in terms of electrification, and there's a lot of effort. So climate change and continued economic growth can continue. And this is hugely important, particularly for the third world, sure, because they're not as wealthy as we are. And to tell them you can't have enough energy to become rich like us is, I think, a bit arrogant, and at the least. And it certainly is not going to be followed because they want to become rich like the Western world.
A lot of really good points there. General Conway, since we're sort of a bit on the topic of technology, I mean, if you think about chips, you think about batteries, you begin to think about the critical minerals. And obviously China has large critical mineral deposits. And I'm wondering, as the focus does get to the need for more semiconductors, more batteries, how is that going to change from a military and a national security perspective as to how we rely on the global infrastructure in China for our energy?
Well, Emily, I think less and less, based upon the progress that we've made, and I give safe credit here for flagging the issue, some 6-7 years ago, on this whole issue of, rare earth elements, which are actually not that rare, okay? They're found in large deposits in the United States, especially we found in a place called Mountain Pass. What's rare is the refining and the refinishing of those elements that are absolutely critical to any industrialized nation and especially to its military. So we've made great strides over the last 4 or 5 years in developing these facilities, and I think there's a clear path ahead, at least in the next probably half a dozen years or so, for the U.S. to be entirely self-sufficient and maybe even be a supplier for the rest of the world in terms of these requirements. So we're not behind the 8 ball like we were when the Chinese first started trying to hoard, the capacity starting about 2010.
Got it. Well, Mr. Smith, General Conway, thank you guys so much for your time. This is a really great, broad-ranging conversation. I think sets us up really well for what's going to be a lot of very interesting panels later today. Thank you both.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.